Thank you. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Judy Fudge, Kent Law School, University of Kent. Judy Fudge's interdisciplinary approach to labor law blends rigorous legal analysis with sophisticated attention to social context. Her groundbreaking work on Canadian labor law history, the nexus between immigration and labor law, precarious work, gender and labor law, and labor rights as human rights has revitalized the field of labor law worldwide by providing an innovative approach to the regulation of work in contemporary labor markets. Judy Fudge.
I'd like to thank the Royal Society for this honor, my mother and father who are here, for always letting me read what I wanted whenever I wanted, my sister, her husband, and my co-vivant for enduring yet another talk about labor law, and Janine Brody for intellectual comradeship over many years. My first encounter with labor law was in 1980, the year before I started law school. I was working at the Toronto Rape Crisis Center, and I joined a solidarity picket line for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, excuse me, who were going out on strike to demand a top-up of maternity pay when workers had babies. They were only receiving 2/3 of their salary, and the demand was for 90%. The postal workers won their demand so that women who bore children no longer suffered a financial penalty for having children. I was hooked on a lifelong endeavor to understand how legal norms and institutions regulate labor markets and the key actors, workers, firms, and unions, and influence the relations between labor and capital and the relations amongst workers. My abiding concern has been to foster equality in status and life chances for people in and through work. My interest was, surprisingly, cultivated in law school, where I had the great good fortune to study and then work with teachers who adopted an interdisciplinary approach to employment and labor law that blended rigorous legal analysis with a sophisticated attention to social context and an enduring concern for social justice. Beginning with my doctoral dissertation, I have been concerned to see how the history of legal intervention has shaped contemporary labor law and policy. Building upon this early research, with Eric Tucker, I wrote Labor Before the Law, which is a history of the emergence of Canadian collective bargaining law in the 20th century. We adopted a bottom-up approach to legal history that was attentive to the social history of the period, and we challenged the received account of the history of collective bargaining law in Canada. Rather than seeing the Canadian model of collective bargaining as a triumph for citizenship at work, we were concerned to understand why so many workers fell outside the ambit of collective labor law, and why, with the profound restructuring that occurred in the early 1980s, the system stopped working for the vast majority of people employed in the private sector. My interest in labor law history has been enduring, and one of my concerns has been to illuminate the social processes that change legal norms and influence legal institutions at work. I have worked with lawyers and historians in order to tell the stories behind key legal cases involving workers and unions. What we discovered was the extent to which judicial findings of fact and reported legal cases act as sieves that filter out social complexity in order to provide a coherent legal narrative that bears only a passing resemblance either to reality or to justice. My concern to understand how legal norms and institutions shape people's working lives and life chances led me to explore the legal regulation of work arrangements that fall outside the standard employment relationship and outside of collective bargaining law, which have traditionally focused on standard workers. I was fortunate to be able to work with legal clinics and women's organizations on employment standards and pay equity. And this early collaboration enabled me to see how legal norms and institutions have reinforced and contributed to, rather than ameliorated, segmentation at work. Beginning in the 1980s and the 1990s, I began to identify the key changes to the labor market and the misfit between legal norms and institutions on the one hand, and the growth of precarious employment on the other. In my work on precarious employment, I have tried to combine social engagement with conceptual rigor. Most recently, I have expanded my research to include migration. My focus has been on the interrelationship between local labor markets and migration. My goal has been to broaden the boundaries of what is traditionally seen as labor law. I have simultaneously been interested in how temporary migrant worker programs make migrant workers vulnerable to exploitation, either by recruiters or by employers, and how migrant worker programs operate as mechanisms to regulate local labor markets, typically by driving prevailing wages and conditions down. The focus of my research has been on migrant workers who are employed at the bottom of the labor market, especially agricultural workers and domestic workers who are employed in private households and who fall outside the scope of most collective bargaining law in Ontario and in this province. As the traditional platform for building and securing labor rights, trade unions have weakened and have been attacked, I have been examining other strategies for achieving justice at work. I have looked at attempts by unions and workers, both in Canada and Europe, to cast labor rights as a type of international human right and to assert them as legal claims before constitutional courts. I am trying to understand how courts see their role when faced with governments and employers who simply want to treat labor as a commodity. Most recently, I have broadened the scope of my research beyond labor markets in the developed world to examine informal employment in developing countries. I am intrigued by the kinds of institutions and strategies that workers, such as waste pickers and domestic workers in India, for example, have developed in order to obtain dignity at work and greater economic and social security. Labor law is now truly international, and I am interested in understanding the relationship between workers in the North and workers in the South as goods and less easily people move about the globe. Labor law, which embodies the struggle to restrict the corrosive effects of unregulated markets, will endure, even though its form may change, as long as people work. Thank you for your patience.